Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. As you've likely heard, the federal government is shut down. And what you may not know is that affects many people's lives. Obviously, we know it affects everybody who's working in Washington, D.C. and at our airports, but it also affects our farmers. So we have Brian Reisinger here with us today to share the behind the scenes to get us a little bit smarter about what the shutdown does and who's actually responsible. Brian, you may remember, he's a journalist, a farmer, and an author. And we talked to him a little while back about his book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. Brian, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So you have some insight into what this is doing to our farmers. I know there's some question about farm aid. I think a lot of people in America have heard about this shutdown, but they don't exactly know how it affects all these different industries. So share a little bit about what's going on with our farmers right now.
Yeah, well, here's how the congressional squabbling affects farmers. For the most part, farmers, like a lot of hardworking families in America, don't have a whole lot of use for government every single day. They're not, in a lot of ways, they are just trying to grow something to be able to sell it to people and make a dollar to keep their farm going. It's as simple as that. However, agriculture and government are very wound up together, whether we like it or not. And what has happened is the government shutdown has placed all kinds of limitations and problems on farmers. There's things like local county offices where they need to go register their crops and things that they're required to do that they're not able to do. And that's kind of a frustration. But the big thing is the way that congressional squabbling has stalled talks around President Trump's tariff package or any kind of a solution around tariff issues. So we're getting tough with other countries. We're negotiating. We're using tariffs where we need to try to drive better deals. That's something that a lot of farmers think we need to do. At the same time, farmers can be affected if a country like China, which we're seeing, decides to snub America's farmers, says we don't want to negotiate with America. We're going to make it tough on America's farmers. Those are things that farmers live with. And so when we have the shutdown stopping things like discussion on tariff aid, that's a real problem. People can decide whether they agree or don't agree with all the things that we're doing around trade. But the reality is that farmers know we need to get tougher. And along with getting tougher can be a little bit of pain. And the problem is that the shutdown is stopping Washington's ability to do anything to help our farmers who are making sacrifices to try to make sure that we have better trade policies for farmers, for workers, for all of our industries.
So, what does this mean? We're hearing that September was the first month that China said that they weren't bringing any American soybeans into China. We know that the president is scheduled to go to Asia later this week. There's obviously some concern about these tariffs. I just saw a commercial this morning for the first time, which was somewhat stunning. That was President Reagan's voice saying tariffs are bad. We shouldn't have tariffs, all this stuff. We know we're coming up to the midterms. The Democrats are holding the government hostage right now. Essentially, they are the reason that this shutdown has occurred. They won't vote for this continuing resolution that's clean. It's the same thing they voted on for years. They won't vote for that. What does this mean when we see Trump going over there? Do you believe he'll go back and forth on some of these tariffs? Do you think that the tariffs are bad? Should the president be the one taking the heat for this?
Here's the reality. The media, in addition to not covering the shutdown properly and not letting the American people understand what's actually driving the shutdown, and you're referring to a lot of it, they're not covering the tariff issue properly. They want to say that, all farmers are against tariffs and they're scared to death and all of this stuff. Here's the reality. Farmers deal with the reality of both impacts by China snubbing us and being upset with our tariffs. They deal with that, but they also deal with 30 years of having unfair trade practices keep prices down. So China, for the 90s and 2000s, a lot of the ways that this affected other industries that you talk about on your show a lot, China and other adversaries, but mainly China, has been buying a massive amount of American agricultural products. And then they'll do things like dump those products. So they'll build the price up and then they'll crash the price. They also cheat on their currency. They use unfair trade standards. So the American farmer doesn't have to have an economic degree to know they've been getting screwed by China for 30 years. And so a lot of farmers, including those who are impacted when China or other countries get upset over tariffs and don't buy our soybeans or whatever else it is, also know that we need to get tougher in order to get better trade deals. So these farmers are saying, hey, let's get tougher. Yes, let's make a deal with China and other countries, but it's got to be a fair deal. It's got to be a tougher deal. It can't be just the wide open trade of the 90s and 2000s that allowed us to get ripped off. So the media is not covering the fact that for farmers, it's complex. They may be in an industry such as soybeans. Our farm grows soybeans and other crops that are affected by the trade dispute, but they're not covering the fact that these farmers have also been affected by China artificially keeping prices low and screwing the American farmer for decades. So farmers want trade, but they want it to be fair trade, and they want to see a strategy through that can force China and other countries to deal with us more fairly. And that's why this shutdown is such terrible, incredibly calamitous timing, because farmers who are willing to make the short-term pain, long-term gain sacrifice that we need to fight for more fair trade standards aren't getting the tariff support that they ought to get if Congress was doing its job.
Do they feel like they're being ignored? Because obviously, if we look at, take Michigan, for example, if you look at the farmland, that's red. They're not voting for Democrats. They're voting for Republicans. Do you feel like farmers are saying Democrats don't care about us because they don't get our vote anyway, so they don't mind keeping the government shut down?
Yeah, I think that they feel like what's going on in Washington is very far off from what's going on in our farm fields. And I don't speak for all farmers, but when I think about my dad who's still farming, my sister who's working to take over our farm, and the work that our family does to try to keep it going, we all know that every single day families like ours are toiling, and people in Washington don't know what's going on the ground on our farms, let alone how it's connected with their debates, let alone how it's connected with the food supply of every American. Because that's the other thing, is it's not just about our farms, but the food of all Americans.
And maybe the Democrats actually don't understand the connection between farms and food, because we're hearing here on the ground that they are desperately trying to take over farms for wind and for solar. In fact, I know a man who runs a solar company in the area, and he said, we're having trouble getting some of the farms between Grand Rapids and Lansing, but the government's going to step in and help us. And I thought, what does that even mean? What is the future of farms with if the Democrat Party gets into control? Because we know that they're going for this green energy, all of this climate change stuff, and that if essentially is taking over family farms.
And one of the problems that we have is that really our government policies for decades now have not accounted for what's going on the farms on the ground. We saw this during the farm crisis in the 1980s. We tell the story in my book. My parents were were married in 1976. That year was a drought. They almost didn't make it through that year. And they were able to do it through hard work and banding together with neighbors. If they hadn't been able to do that, they'd have had to take out a whole lot of debt just to survive the year. And they'd have gone.
You need those neighbors.
That's right. That's right. And the 1980s farm crisis wiped out farms that took on a lot of debt. So if my parents hadn't been able to avoid that debt just before that economic storm hit, there'd have been huge trouble. And our government for a very long time has failed to understand. And what I'll say is the Democrats have generally decided that this government program or that program is going to solve things. And something that for a while the Republicans forgot, and I think that this is changing, but for a while the Republicans forgot that the farmer is the little guy, and that we have to stand up for small independent farmers and small independent businesses in this country too. And a lot of that is changing now. But the reality is that farmers have felt left behind for a very long time in many ways.
It's interesting that you said that about Republicans. I was at a meeting just over the weekend where it was one of the GOP dinners where everybody comes and they give their spiel as to why they should be elected. And over again, I heard Republicans get up and say, government needs to help step into the family farm and take over and give money and be involved in the details of the family farm. And I thought, I am not hearing that from farmers. I'm hearing get out of our family farm. The government in Michigan is so heavily involved in the family farm. You've got the environmentalists that are in there all the time, constantly. Oh, we don't like the way you're getting rid of waste. We don't like the way you're dealing with water. We don't like the way you're washing your machinery. They are telling me on a regular basis, get off our land. Why? How did this happen that Republicans started to get the wrong idea about how government reacts to business?
Here's what happened in the case of farms. Going back to the Depression, there was this huge government intervention, right, into our farms, into our agriculture, and agriculture and government got all wound up together. And whether that was right or wrong, a lot of it people thought was going to be emergency. And after the Depression, it really wasn't. It just continued. And what our government did under both parties, the establishment of the Republican Party as well as the Democrats, just kind of kept piling government programs on top of government programs, right? So now we have the current farm program, and I think that people inside farming, outside farming, all over the political spectrum, none of them like what we have with our farm programs. Everyone has something to criticize about farm subsidies, right? And the reason that it's so bad is because we got just program after program piled on top of one another. We don't know which ones are working. We don't know which ones are contradictory, because a lot of them do run into one another. And we don't know which ones have become prone to favoritism and abuse. And that's even before you get into the way that increasing regulations and increasing taxes cause problems for farmers every single day. So we need a bipartisan family farm moonshot where we go through all these programs, figure out which ones are working and which ones aren't. Get rid of the ones that aren't. Make sure the ones that are there are doing what they're supposed to do. Because it is true in this country, Tudor, that farmers are both able to say, hey, where are my taxpayers going? Where are my taxpayer dollars going? And where's that support that was supposed to be coming from the family farm? Both things are true. Taxpayers and farmers both deserve to be frustrated because our government isn't working right and it's just standing in the way.
How much danger are we in, though, to really have a food availability problem here in the United States? Because we are seeing farms close. It seems like, I mean, as I'm reading about what's going on, it's like, okay, meat and dairy farms are closing. It's not necessarily affecting the amount of meat and dairy that we have, but now we've got these powerful conglomerates and the family farm is no longer there. What does that mean for the future of the country?
Yeah, what we're seeing is the warning shots of an incredibly unsustainable, incredibly insecure food supply. We saw it during COVID. We also see it with bird flu. What I mean by that is people remember during COVID, you couldn't find the food you needed on the grocery store shelves. If you could, the prices way through the roof. That was the same time that farmers were struggling to sell their goods. The problem wasn't farmers willing to sell and customers wanting to buy. The problem was our vulnerable supply chain. So as we lose farms, we've been losing farms at the rate of 45,000 a year for the past century.
What?
45,000 a year for the past century on average.
How is that possible that the supply has not gone dramatically down? I don't understand.
And that's what's happened is we have roughly, it's less land somewhat, but roughly the same amount of land, roughly the same amount of food being produced by just far fewer and fewer companies. And it's not just farms, it's all the companies that are in between the farms and the dinner table. And so what happens when you have these really consolidated industries is if you have one great big distribution center go down, that affects the supply of whatever that food is. So we saw it across all kinds of food with COVID. During bird flu, we saw it with chicken and eggs. If you had one big distribution center go down or one, whatever the case may be, a logistical thing with, trucks, something happens, it has a massive impact on our supply chain. The price of food goes up. And so what we're seeing with COVID, bird flu, this stuff happens all the time. The reason that the price of food has gone up so much faster than that runaway inflation that we had a couple of years ago is because we have a vulnerable supply chain that is constantly facing these shocks. And so we're seeing kind of the warning shots of a deeply vulnerable food supply every day.
How has lobbying hurt farming? We had John Stossel on here a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how lobbying, the Humane Society has this huge lobby that was going into states and getting stores that sell puppies shut down because they had that power. They had so much money that they had created this narrative that they were unsafe and that these dogs were from puppy mills. And there was this whole hullabaloo. We can't have these puppy mills out there, so we're going to shut it down. The truth was, those stores were not unsafe. The dogs were not coming from unsafe places. They had to actually be cared for. It was actually more controls when you knew where these dogs were coming from. But that's how this lobbying works. And it's not unlike what I've heard from farmers where slaughterhouses have been shut down, family slaughterhouses. You have to go to these big corporations. And I mean, I know that Thomas Massey doesn't have a great reputation right now in Washington, but I remember years ago he had the Prime Act, which was going to say, hey, we've got to be allowing these family slaughterhouses to open back up because you're shutting down the family farm. They're not unhealthy. They're not unsafe. This was just a massive amount of money from these big corporations that went to government and bought essentially the right to shut down the family slaughterhouse.
Yeah. Here's what happens with government power. It accumulates and it keeps building. And so once you have an interest of one kind or another that gets a whole bunch of power, they just keep on growing it because they're able to write the policies. And also it's the biggest players in any industry that not only are able to pay the lobbyists, but they're also able to pay the armies of lawyers and accountants that it takes to navigate government. And so what happens is, even let's just say for a second that there's like a well-intentioned regulation of some kind, right? Even the well-intentioned regulations, of which many are not, but even a well-intentioned one goes across an entire industry, and it's the biggest players that are best able to deal with it. navigate it. They have the money and they have the resources and the professionals to help them navigate through those stormy waters of government. And so it's always the mom and pop shops of any industry that get affected. In the case of farms, what has really happened is farms have been forced to get bigger or get out. I mean, where I grew up, we still have some small farms, got some medium farms, some larger farms. And I'll be honest with you, you look down the road and whatever size the farm is these days, we're happy that the farms are surviving. And we hope that we can have more farms of all sizes, including small farms. We're happy farms are surviving because they've been forced to get bigger, get out. And it's really been done by other bigger industries and government officials who haven't understood what's going on. And farms of any size right now, even the bigger ones, in many cases are the little guy relative to the folks that they're dealing with in the global economy.
Let me ask you about work on the farm, because we've heard from Democrats that if there's a closed border, that there won't be anybody to work on the farms. We have migrant workers in Michigan that go all over the country. They go from farm to farm. They're not illegal immigrants. They are legal and they go from state to state to farm. What is your impression of what they're saying? Is that accurate, that if the border is closed, we'll struggle? I mean, and if it were accurate, I would say, okay, there are ways to solve that without having to open a border, obviously. But what are you hearing from the farming industry?
Yeah, absolutely. This is another issue where our farms are caught in cross-cutting political winds, because many farmers from rural America, a lot of President Trump's support came from rural America, and many farmers that included support for making sure that we secure our border. And that's from families that, feel that that's important, while at the same time, they may have immigrant labor, people that they work with. About half of our labor for farms comes from immigrant labor in this country. Here's the reality. What you said is exactly right. We can both secure the border and have a legally secured workforce. The H-2A Farm Visa Worker Program is a program that can be used. You can secure a legal workforce. What we really need to be doing is focusing on things that we can all agree on, like crackdown on the cartels that don't only traffic drugs, they also traffic people. And they make it harder for farms and other businesses to know whether the people that they're employing have a legal status or don't have a legal status, right? So we can have this world where we secure the border and where we are able to secure the workforce that we need through legal forms such as the Farm Visa program. And you see that across Michigan, where I'm from. Our farm was a little small to have immigrant labor, but farms that weren't much bigger than ours did. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think the American people do that kind of thing all day. Only Congress would leave us in this place where we are forced by the politicians and the media to feel like we have to choose between, a legal workforce or a secure border. We don't have to do that.
Such an interesting point. In the manufacturing world, I think that we cross paths quite a bit. When I would go and talk to our farmers and talk about some of the challenges that we faced in manufacturing at the steel foundry, they would say, it's amazing how much that overlaps with the challenges that we face. And it was the same. I was talking to a friend I had worked with years ago the other day, and he was just going on and on about how could Trump do this whole idea of, they're kidnapping people off the streets. I said, you worked at the shop with me. You don't remember ICE coming in and raiding the shop and taking people out because we didn't know. They had papers that seemed that they were legit. They weren't legit. Did you consider that kidnapping them? Oh, they're not even committing crimes. I said, by your standard, these people didn't either. They stole someone's identity. They were making money, but that wasn't a crime that was like, you weren't killing someone. So under your theory, that's not a crime. But it was always happening. How did the Democrats effectively turn this narrative when Obama was the deporter in chief, like I said, coming in, raiding? He was raiding farms. He was raiding manufacturing facilities. I'm sure he was also raiding slaughterhouses at that time. It was never reported on. There was never a report in Michigan when we were raided. How did they flip this narrative? Is it just that they're not able to get rural America, and so they've decided they're going to try to come up with some narrative that will get people out to vote?
I think there's a lot of politics that get played and that factor into that kind of thing. The other thing I think that's going on is there's these big structural changes, like as we have more of rural America voting Republican, more of urban America voting Democrat, and our cities really become like islands of like deep, deep blue. That's happening at the same time that we've lost a lot of media outlets. You've lost a lot of local hometown newspapers that didn't care about
Yeah.
what was going on in New York City. They cared about what was going on with the local basketball game. You know, we've lost a lot of papers like that and other news outlets like that. And so what happens is you have so much of the media narrative is dominated by people who are in really big cities who either their media outlets are the ones that reach these areas, or those media outlets own the media outlets in those areas. And so that's another form of industry consolidation. But we have this world where we don't have rural and urban really talking, and we don't have media that is showing people information that, like, we can all agree on, like, basic facts. It's just gotten worse and worse. And so I think that's a big part of it too, is just the way that our media has gradually gotten out of touch with what's going on in our small towns and our rural areas and even our medium-sized cities. You know, anything that isn't a big major urban center, they're kind of out of touch with.
You make such a great point that I think people don't necessarily understand. I mean, as we're talking about farms getting bigger and fewer people owning farms, they just are getting bigger and becoming big corporations. It's the same thing with the local newspaper. It's the same thing with your local news station. Your news station is a part of news stations across the country. You've seen those videos where you see 50 different news stations all having the same report. It's true. It literally, they're being bought up by one side or the other, one political side or the other. And behind the scenes, I mean, you and I have probably heard the same thing. It's like, okay, if we can get all of these local newspapers, it will seem very organic that this is the message that is being put out when it is actually a political message that is being put out.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. And things just get further and further out of touch with everyday people. Now, there are really good people at companies of all kinds, and there are good people at that are trying to fight these kinds of forces anywhere, everywhere, right? But it's individual people against a bigger system that is really just disconnecting people from one another, and that's, you said the word community. I thought that was so important because where I'm from, where I grew up, and I know that it's similar where your folks are from, you've got that individualism that it takes to deal with whatever your problem is, out on the farm, out on the factory floor, whatever it is. And you've also got that sense of community come running when a neighbor's in trouble. And those two things, you can be individualistic and you can also care about your community. And I think a lot of people, especially in our media narrative, maybe isn't true in our day-to-day lives as much, but especially in the media narrative and the social media narrative, it feels like we're all just so disconnected. And that sense of local community is so important.
I think you make a good point because right now we're seeing this return to church. We're seeing young men returning to the church. The church is very powerful in the rural areas. And as I've been researching, I think I've mentioned on the podcast, there's been evidence even after Katrina that the areas that had higher church membership, they were able to return to normal faster and in fact even grow because of that support system and always knowing there was a home base that had the supplies you needed. I think that has threatened Democrats coming up in this election because obviously we saw what happened with Charlie Kirk, and then instead of rioting and people arguing and screaming and yelling, we ended up having the largest church service we've ever seen and kind of this revival of we're going to rely on each other, we're going to forgive, we're going to move on, we're going to love one another. That's something that we haven't seen coming out of their party. In fact, you look at what's happening in New York right now, and they're all kind of fractured. You see Hakeem Jeffries is still being asked, are you going to endorse Mamdani? Nobody knows what he's going to do. He's in a pretty rough situation because you're talking about someone who's socialist. He's saying he's a socialist. A lot of the things that he's promoting are actually communist. The city of New York, we don't know what will happen to it. Democrats have this kind of fractured message right now of the far left and then trying to pull toward the middle. And those who are trying to pull toward the middle are still absolutely struggling with that. This is hard for them in the midterms, but they did the same thing with the government shutdown in 2018. They believe that this hurts the president. It's interesting. I have a friend who is my age. She's not a conservative. I noticed a post on Facebook about the government shutdown because her SNAP benefits are under threat. She's disabled. She gets SNAP benefits. And the end of her post was very interesting to me. Someone who, like I said, not a conservative, she signed off with this by saying, thanks a lot, Dems. And then I thought, wow, That must really be painful for the Democrats, because this is non-political, non-conservative person who is recognizing, probably for one of the first times, that it is the Democrats who chose to shut down the government, and they are harming the people that need the help the most. What does this do? Does this have the same effect as 2018, or does this shutdown hurt the Democrats?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, partially because media narrative is going to go and what people are going to be told. And there's also the fact that, midterms can always naturally be challenging for the party that has the White House, right? Like just that situation that can occur irregardless. But I do think that when you think about what's going on with the shutdown and with any of these other issues, I think that people, especially in rural areas, and I don't speak for all farmers or everybody, but in rural areas, I think what people are interested in is who's going to upset the economic status quo to try to make things better for me. And I think it's similar, in steel country and other places, because these are places that have been seeing economic decline for decades. It's not just like whatever's happened in the economy the last couple of years or whatever, it's really about, hey, we've been losing our farms. We've been losing our other resource industries. We've been losing population in small towns. We've been losing industrial jobs in more recent decades. And so people have been seeing their economy decline. Even if the unemployment number or the stock market is going up or down, there's still an overall decline going on in a lot of rural and small town America. And so I think people are interested in hearing who's going to do something to make my life better economically, who's going to change and shake things up. And the problem with the shutdown is what they're hearing is just more games in Washington, shutting things down for political reasons, more getting filled by more politicians who've been out of touch with them for decades anyway.
How do people feel about this Secretary of Agriculture? We have Brooke Rollins now as the Secretary of Ag. A lot of us learned for the first time that she went to school for this. She was in 4-H. She was a farmer. She grew up in the world of agriculture, but she has been hit by the media so many times as just this pretty face that doesn't know anything about this industry, which is a total lie. How do farmers feel about what she's been doing?
I think farmers have felt, as I've talked with, honestly, farmers, rank and file, ag groups, people really from different parts of the political spectrum, they say that they feel that she listens. They feel that there's an ear at the USDA to hear what they're saying, talk about it, and try to balance these things. For example, and she's talked about, the fact that with tariffs, you can use tariffs to get tougher on negotiations, create more fair trade, drive harder bargains with countries, but we have to be aware there's an impact on our farmers in the meantime. She's talked about those things. When we talk about trying to find a way to make America healthy again and do that in a way that makes sure that farming doesn't get hit with government mandates and take the good of make America healthy again and make sure also that we're helping farms that are small businesses not deal with heavy-handed government. I think they feel like Secretary Rollins is stopping and listening and trying to balance some very, very difficult things.
Well, good. And I hope that we see some relief for our farmers soon. I hope that this shutdown ends. We'll see what the Democrats decide. I kind of wonder if they're trying to get through the election in November and see what happens in Virginia, what happens in New Jersey, what happens in New York. Obviously, those are big elections for everybody, and they right now seem to have the upper hand in those states. But we'll see what happens. So I appreciate you being here. Brian Reisinger, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks so much for being with me. I appreciate it. I think we can find a way forward where we can get this government opened up and we can find a way to negotiate family-first trade deals, tough deals that are fair to our farmers and our workers. It's just a matter of the politicians understand what's going on the ground and trying to get some work done.
Well, hopefully that helps, having a Secretary of Agriculture who understands, and Secretary Rollins is able to take that back. And I hope that she's able to communicate that to Congress, although it seems like they're being stubborn at the moment. But every day is a new day, and we wait to hear if they've decided that they're going to push forward and open back up the government. So we'll see. Thank you.
We'll see. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining the Tudor Dixon Podcast. As you know, you can subscribe at TudorDixonPodcast.com. Go to the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always watch at Rumble or YouTube at Tudor Dixon. And join us next time. Have a blessed day.